Hi and welcome to another Coiro video, and this time it's number 4 in our Commodore Resurrection series. And this time I promised you that we would be looking into a whole system and not just a loose mainboard. And we are coming up to a bad start. This 64C appears to be working totally fine. So let's find a new one. And this is a really old bread bin. It has some cracks here in the lid above the function keys. You can see that it has not the 5-pin DIN for signal, so it's not the first revision mainboard. But this is a really early sample, and you can also see that this is made in the USA, and that's not very common for machines in the PAL versions sold in Europe. But let's test it and see what happens. And what do you know, this also works just perfect. Okay, off again with this one, and let's try to find another candidate. This time it's also a C64C, and this is the middle versions. It's not the latest cost-reduced version, but is the Hong Kong variant of the machine. And I can't turn it on. The power switch is totally stuck. I will try to wiggle it. I have seen some of these switches getting stuck, but this is really in there. And it did break. So this needs a new power switch. On some of these switches, if you manage to loosen them up a bit, you just spray them with some contact cleaner and stuff, and they can just work fine afterwards. But sometimes they just break. Yeah, this is, as I said, the middle version of this machine. It has the 3 screws and not just the snap-on clips that was on the later machines, and that's mostly the ones with the internal video RAM, so this probably has the external video RAM chip. And the machine looks really nice and clean inside, and just a gleamy, not corroded RF shield. And I have to dismount the keyboard and take the motherboard out of the case before we can come to the power switch. And this has 2 3mm screws for the keyboard, and it has the longest screws in each corner where the keyboard support are. The rest of the screws is a bit shorter. And as you can see, the RF shields acts also as a heat spreader for the CPU, the VIC-2 chip and the SID chip, it seems. And this is quite the area with aluminum, so if these springs is firmly attached and the heat compound is working, this is a really good heat spreader, not as bad as on the early C64s. Yeah, we just have to lift out the board to see what the bottom look like, and this is totally clean. It's almost looks unused. Yeah, then just to power up the soldering iron, and I also have to power up my desoldering tool. And you can see this white heat compound is working quite good after all these years. It's still quite sticky. Yeah, I've seen a lot of guys on YouTube, they actually apply fresh solder before they desolder any chip. On these Commodore 64 boards, I tend not to do this if the solder is not very gray and cracked. Otherwise it works just fine with taking one single swipe at this with the gun. The problem with this gun is that the hole in the front is kind of narrow, so I have to take around the pins on the thick ones that's connected to the ground plane, and it's just meant to keeping the switch fastened to the frame. Yes, but there it is, one loose switch. Yes, let's just take a short walkthrough of the power supply circuit on the C64C and how it might differ from the ordinary C64. When it comes here to the power connector and the input, it is exactly the same, and the power bricks are interchangeable, between each model, and it's also the same that was used on all the newer VIC-20s. You have the 9-volt AC supplied on pin 6 and 7, and you have the plus 5 volts supplied on pin 5 with the ground return on pin 2. And that's exactly like the other C64s. And the arrangement on the side here with the rocket switch and power connector is also all the same. But when you come to the inside here, you can actually see that there is a coil here on the earth wire. And that's not present on the original C64, and that's probably there of noise suppression reasons. The other coils are about the same as they was on the ordinary C64. This is a double pole coil, and this is a single liner coil that's placed on the motherboard. And the switch is also the same, and it's coupled the same, and this is a 2-pole actually on-on switch. This is one line broken from the 5 volt and one from the 9 volt AC. And back in the day we actually had a fault where this rocker switch broke, and it made an internal short for the 5 volt and 9 volt AC, and that actually damaged the RAM chips on board. So if you have a default RAM chip and you had this type of rocker switch, you always changed both. And that's the input circuit, and then we go further in and we can see there is a lot more changed. Here you can actually see that there is no 7805 and there are no 7812 or 09 as it should be to supply the newer SID versions with 9 volt instead of 12 volt. And when we see the circuit here, there actually is no auxiliary 5 volt supply. So apparently they've sorted out the noise problems that was on the original C64, where they had to use a separate 5 volt supply for the VIC-2 chip to make the picture less noisy. And the 9 volt or 12 volt, if you use the newer SID versions versus the older SID versions, actually is supplied via a series linear regulator. And it's stated here that if you are using the old SID version, you should have CR7 as a CN diode, and this should be the 12.6 volt version. Or if you're using the 8580 newer SID, this should be a 9.6 CN diode here on CR7. So otherwise than that, it's almost exactly the same. You have the 9 volt unregulated AC that goes to the user port as AC, and you also supplies this to the circuit for the tape motor assembly, and that's controlled by a transistor that's then close to the tape port. And you have one more enigma in here that is the same on all C64C schematics, and I have not been able to figure this out. And this is this resistor over here that's marked with R19. This is connected to ground on one end, and the other end is just hanging here loose. And I do wonder if this is supposed to go on the other end of the rocker switch, so that this will be a bleeding resistor to the 5 volt or something when the computer is shut down. Otherwise, I'm not sure what this is doing here, and it's certainly pictured like there is no connection at this end. And as I said, I've looked through all schematics I found online for the shortboard version of the C64, and this is the same everywhere. So this makes no sense to me. Yes, and that's really the simplicity of this power supply. It's much less chip count, and it does what it should do for the C64C, and I don't think there is any bad decisions around this. This looks like a sturdy, good solution. Yeah, and this switch really got it bad. I can feel that something is broken inside here, and I don't think I will bother to take this out and see what's faulty inside. I do have some more switches available, and this is actually a new replacement part. It's not original Commodore 64 new old stock switches. If I were a rich man. Yes, this is the switch we are replacing, and since this clearly is off its rocker, we have to use a completely different switch. And When you switch to a different switch, to put it like that, there are a lot of things you have to figure out and what needs to be the same. And you have the spacing between the pins, of course. You have the spacing from the pins and to the front. Last but not least is actually the size of the plastic rocker itself, that it will fit through the hole, and that the placement of the rocker is so that it will actually fit the hole. And Commodore, during its lifetime, I have experienced 6 different switches, but there might be more. Some of these I've only seen as replacement parts, and some of them is used in production batches, and there might be many more during all the years the C64 was produced. I've just not seen them. What I do these days is that I do have one or more, I think 2 original C64 replacement switches left, but those I save for special occasions. So what I use now is this switch that's available from Moser and DigiKey. And it's a switch from NKK that's called M2022 TXW41-FA. And this switch is almost exactly what we need. The pins are spaced all the same, the rocker is the same size, and it fits right in most cases. But you do have to be careful with one thing, and that I will show you. You do have to make one modification on this switch if you are going to use this one. And if you see on the bottom here, you actually see that there is some spacers underneath here that prevents this switch to come close enough down to the printed circuit board. So what I do, I take some thin pliers and I just cut here. You can also use a file or whatever you have at hand to cut down on these sides here. Yeah, so you must use whatever you have handy to cut down the sides over here and make this so it comes closer to the printed circuit board. In some cases I've just cut here and I've bent this sideways. In some cases I actually cut these, and in some cases I have used the file to just take them away. And in some cases this actually has broken off, so that I have not had any fastings in the front of the switch when I tried this. But all the recent batches that I got of these switches, they work just fine just to cut here and just bend these parts. Or you just use a file or a grinder or a Dremel or whatever, and you just take away these parts so it will look approximately like so. Then this switch will be an exact good replacement for the switch. And this is, as of this making of this video, they have it in stock both on Moser and on DigiKey. I think DigiKey had the most in stock. But if you will be kind enough to just wait a couple of days before you order yours, as I only have 2 of these switches left, I'm going to order 5 more. So if you just can hold on to, I have ordered mine, so I'm sure that they won't run out of stock before I've got mine in house. I'm only joking, of course. Yes, just admiring the stunning reassemblance before I actually solder in the new switch. Yeah, and the new switch is fitting perfectly into the holes. So we just solder 1 or 2 legs until we check that the alignment is about right. And then we just solder all the rest of the legs and fasten the switch firmly to the board. Yeah, and then we have to attach the power and the video signal to just make a small test to see if this board actually tested okay. You have to remember that we have never actually turned on this C64 before. And of course this was just working, so we do have to make a final test with the test harness to test that the I/O chips and everything else is okay on this board. And that's the usually finally test we do on all things we repair on this channel. And as you can see, my test harness looks like something that's thrown together with loose parts in the shortest amount of time, and that is actually just precisely what it is. But it's fully working and it's good enough for testing the occasional C64. Yes, in the later years there actually have been made some improvement on these test harnesses, but I have not made the modifications to this one. I just fast forward a bit now through the memory tests to get a result as fast as possible. Yeah, and so far everything looks okay. Yeah, as you can hear, I also managed to get the video grabber to sample the audio, so the sound chip in this sounds absolutely perfect. Yeah, so now it's just about disconnecting the test harness and getting this back into the case again, and then we will just do a final power on test. Yeah, and here I just make sure that the rocker switch is actually moving as it should inside the hole, because this can be a very narrow fit, and if you don't cut the right amount of the switch, it will not fit closely enough to the PCB, and you might have to use a file or something and take out something of the hole around the switch. But finally I do approve, and this is a good enough fit. It's just remarkable how bright and shiny this metal cover are after more than 30 years. Yes, and this is just a short walkthrough to make sure that you do not screw up when you put your case together. And on my C64C here there are 3 different screws. On some I've actually seen 4 different kinds of screws. But on this one, the short plastic threaded screws should go in the fastening to the main board, these 5 here. And also the same screws are used where it's marked green, and this is the screws that you put in from the bottom to fasten the top lid of the case. And if you use these long screws here for that, you will actually get them to puncture the case. So below the keyboard you will get these plastic bumps that sticks up through the surface, and that's a very common mistake. And if you use these long screws back here or some other place, you will get the same phenomenon on the bottom of the case where you have these plastic bumps. So it's very important to use the short screws on all these cases. The reason why these screws are longer is because they also have to go through the metal bracket for the keyboard fastening. So they are slightly longer and must not be mistaken with the others. And then there is the 3mm machine threaded screw that goes to fasten the keyboard on top of the brackets. And that's really all there is to this. So the main thing to remember is be careful when using the long screws. They are only meant to use them through the metal brackets for the keyboard. Everything else is short screw. And in some cases I've seen a slightly different screw for these 3 screws here, but the main difference I've seen is that they are the same length, but the head is a bit different. It's a slightly bigger head on those. So that's it, and if you do it like this, you won't screw up your case. Yeah, and here I put in the 2 long ones first, then I'm sure I'm not trying to use them elsewhere afterwards. And then I just put in all the short plastic threaded screws. The plug for the keyboard is keyed. There is missing 1 pin on the keyboard, and make sure to align that correct to the keyboard connector. On some of these connectors there is a hole in this one, so you are able to put it in the wrong way if you don't pay attention. The keyboard light, the LED, will actually light up if you plug this the other way around, as it's a 3-pin connector. Yeah, and then it's just the final test to see that we have coupled everything together and that the machine still starts up, and it does. Yeah, so now it's just to put in the 3 last screws, and remember, these are short screws, so you don't puncture your keyboard. And then we have another one in the books. That was my 4th installment in the C64 Resurrection series. And in this episode we actually plowed to 3 different C64s. We had one C64C that was working perfectly, and the same with one rather old bread bin that was made in the USA and had a small plastic issue. But it was working fine, and it had a good picture and so on. So what we did in this episode was actually to fix this one. And this was a rather newer Hong Kong C64C with, yeah, it had the screw hole cabinet, and it also had the main board with the external color chip, so it was not the newest edition of the C64. But this time it was a rather simple fault, and it was a rather short diagnosis, but hopefully you learned something about the walkthrough of the power supply and also about the replacement switch that I use when I come to the conclusion that the switch needs to be changed. So, hope you enjoyed the content. Please hit like and do subscribe if you want to be notified when we post new videos. It will really help out the channel if you did subscribe. So, until next one, thanks for watching.